Is that me? Okay. Gracias.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today to accompany us in a new episode of our cycle, Rethinking Tomorrow. I'm going to start talking in English now so that my colleague can understand what I'm saying about him. We have a wonderful team of translators, and I'm going to change into English now.
Immense pleasure to introduce Brett Scott. He is an exceptional writer who has written two very interesting books. To give a very short description of his trajectory, he is an anthropologist by training, and somehow he might explain how he became a trader of exotic derivative contracts during the economic crisis in 2008, and then after that he used his experience to write this very interesting book called Heretic's Guide to Global Finance: Hacking the Future of Money, where he describes basically what high finance looks like from the inside. Mm-hmm. And then, this book was coming out during the Occupy movement, as I think dubbed by David Graeber. Mm-hmm. Two very good companions to each other, these two books. And then when I met him some years ago, he was already writing for The Guardian about money. He had a column there. He was writing for The New Scientist, for Wired magazine, for a whole bunch of different places, and working in a variety of projects that investigate money and what it does to communities and societies, and how could it work differently, what alternative ways of dealing with money, using it, or could be. And then he wrote the book that brings us today here, Cloudmoney, which talks about the intersection between the technology, the tech industry, and the financial world, which is a marriage that seems to bring the worst of each partner, and also writes a super interesting Substack bulletin. What's the name? Newsletter. Yeah. Newsletter, in español, boletín, about money, called Altered States of Money. So, welcome to Madrid.
Thank you. It's good to be back here.
And first of all, I would like to ask you, how does an anthropologist end up trading exotic derivative contracts?
Sure. Historically, anthropology, when it first began, was actually you'd have people from powerful societies kind of going into less powerful societies, and it was historically quite associated with colonialism and these processes. But often you'd find anthropologists coming from like London, places like that, ending up somewhere very far away in some colonial territory. And this was had a kind of, that was sort of the original way anthropology formed. But towards the sort of 1980s and stuff, you started to find lots of critique internal to anthropology, where anthropologists were saying, actually, we've got to be more aware of the power dynamics of this process where you can go and study other groups. And also that there was an emergence of a field called upward anthropology, where you go into more powerful parts of society than what you come from. All right, so this is when people started going into the financial sector. You'd have anthropologists going into finance, or going, for example, right now, going into big tech, to explore the dynamics internal to these big, powerful institutions. So I guess my explorations in the financial sector were quite inspired by that tradition. And I was coming from also quite a politically radical type of background. And so I found it fascinating to go and explore the financial sector and to look at what the internal dynamics were. And that's what led to my first book. But I always keep this quite anthropological style. I'm always trying to immerse myself in communities who, many different types of communities. And over the last 10 years, I've spent I've been involved with many different types of groups who have been trying to either change the financial system or believe that they're changing the financial system, or and so I have in Cloudmoney, I'm bringing together a lot of that kind of stuff and looking at this intersection between the technology community and the sort of tech world with the finance world as relates to the monetary system.
Well, personally, one of the things that I like the most about your books is the fact that you have a great talent for metaphor, for using the right metaphors to describe things that are meant to be very difficult to describe, and I think it's a lucky place that you landed in, because both the technology world and the financial world also have a habit of using metaphors, but their metaphors tend to be a strategy for obscuring
exactly.
Activities that sometimes are not particularly legal. No, as we discovered with the financial crisis, that it was not that the subprimes and all these difficult terms were difficult because the actions were difficult. The actions were easy; they were just illegal, so they were renamed.
Metaphor is a dangerous art form. But when the reason that I use lots of metaphors is that large parts of the monetary system, but also more generally the financial system, which is kind of built on top of that, it's invisible. You can't see it. All right. So in a room like right here, we're actually all connected together via monetary systems. Right. This is what holds together whole market economies, but you can't see it. So you have these vast systems which are basically invisible, which means we lack visual imagery for them, and actually metaphor can be a good way to sort of create visual imagery to help a person sort of grapple and understand a very large-scale system, which would otherwise be too difficult to conceptualize. So I try to create these metaphors which enable a person to sort of picture. But it's dangerous because metaphors can also be misleading sometimes.
Well, I think you do a very good job, and I'm going to start with the first kind of foundational metaphor of the book. The second maybe foundational metaphor of the book, which is that you describe the financial world as a nervous system, and I really like it because then you kind of use the stack, like Benjamin Bratton's stack, I think, as a model, because you're talking in tiers, which I really enjoy because I like telecommunications infrastructures. But describe maybe for the audience today why money is a nervous system and not any other kind of system, and what let's say particularities this would have.
Sure, this is quite I'll try to do this in a simple way because this is quite a complex area, but historically, when people have sought out metaphors for money, they've often used blood metaphors. If you especially have bodily metaphors for money, people will often describe money as like the circulatory system, with like blood being pumped through the economy. And you'll still find this to this day in, say, the financial sector. The financial sector will often characterize itself as being like the beating heart of the economy. It pumps blood to the industries. So it's using the substance, blood metaphor, and this is actually used by many people. And this idea that money somehow carries value around, all right? And it's a lot of sort of substance imagery. And there's a whole history to how this metaphor has come to be and why it exists, which I won't go into here because it's probably too complex. But I find that it's an extremely problematic metaphor because it misidentifies, should I say, or it mischaracterizes the source of value in an economy. The source of value in any economy is human beings and ecosystems. Every single thing around us, from this here to like every single thing, comes from human beings applying themselves to the earth and like building stuff. All right, and this occurs no matter what economy you've been in. You find this in hunter-gatherer societies all the way through to modern super large-scale capitalist systems. All right, and this is the underlying actual sort of value. I would maybe, if you want to call it blood or something like that, this is the underlying sort of body of the economy. And then monetary systems are often actually embedded in that, like a nervous system, which will activate stuff. All right, so. If you think about like my arm here, I have all these cells and stuff, and I can send messages to activate it. All right, and monetary systems are very much like this. I can make action happen through triggering people through the monetary system. And actually, large-scale financial institutions like banks, this is often what they're doing. They will be sending these huge. They will be steering and sort of pushing out large amounts of these kind of nervous impulses, as it were, to mobilize large numbers of people. I can tail this metaphor off there, but it's. I feel like the nervous system metaphor is a much more accurate metaphor than the blood metaphor. And once you start to get into it, you can really start to see how the financial sector and the monetary system operates as this kind of vast nervous system.
I think definitely it's very useful. Also, from this, you derive a description of the different kinds of money that we are dealing with today. Yeah. And one of the things that is very surprising about the book is really how different these kinds of money are. Like, one of the bases of your book is that the money that you carry in your pocket is not the same thing as the money that you have in the bank.
Yeah.
So, and then you use another really useful metaphor.
This is where metaphors get dangerous, because they start to like cross over with each other. So let's like push aside the nervous system metaphor for a while. All right, because there's a more like foundational one, and then we can.
Yes. So the reason, one of the hearts of this book is that there is a difference between the different kinds of money that we use indistinctively during the day, I guess. When you pay with cash in a restaurant, or you pay with a card, or even when you pay with Bitcoin, if you can these days, you're actually using 3 different kinds of money.
Yeah, and so one of the problems you have, so if you go, for example, onto Google, and you were to type money onto the image search box of Google, you'll find, the first thing is you'll find a lot of imagery of cash, okay, which is the physical units of money, which I spend a lot of my book defending, right? But this is the sort of dominant visual imagery people have of monetary systems, is of these sort of physical tokens, all right? But interestingly, if you go and type digital money into that same image search, what you'll find is pictures of cash sort of dissolving into data,
into
or
pixels.
A hand coming through a computer grabbing cash, or cash flying through wires, right? So what basically people have there's an imagery that what digital money is that it's basically like cash, except somehow related to some kind of like digital thing, right? So people have built this sort of idea that what's happening is that cash is sort of just becoming digital money, all right? In reality, though, these are completely separate systems with completely separate issuers, with completely separate dynamics, all right? And the metaphor that I use to describe how this works in the book is the metaphor of a casino, all right? So if I walk into a casino with, say, 100 euros in cash, and I hand it to a casino, and they will give me chips, casino chips. Now, those casino chips are a secondary form of money that's issued by the casino. It's a kind of privately issued form of money that you can use inside the casino. And now there's actually 2 different types of money here. There's the cash behind the counter, and then there's these chips, which have been issued by the casino. And actually, the banking sector does something very similar in our society. If you hand cash to a bank, it actually issues out to you digital chips. So those units in your bank account are privately issued digital chips, as it were, digital casino chips, in a sense, that you can use within the digital payment system. So when we're talking about the move away from cash towards digital money, you're talking about becoming ever more enclosed in these private systems where you're using these essentially bank-issued and corporate-issued chips, all right? And there's very And actually then there's all these sort of these third tier types of systems like PayPal, which will take those chips that you own and then issue you new chips. So if you have a PayPal account, for example, you have a kind of like a third level form of money, which is connected back to the second level form of money, which is eventually connected back to the actual original form. Right.
Which is even more private.
The
PayPal one, because it not only depends on the banks, but it depends on the PayPal, and then having electricity, etc.
So what's called the cashless society is a society where essentially you become totally dependent upon these privately issued digital casino chips for all kinds of transactions, right? And this is where a lot of the political implications emerge from that situation.
Well, one of the things that you explain in the book, which I found very interesting, is that you use this metaphor of the casino as opposite to another one that we collectively use, even without thinking too much about it. Probably because we've all watched the same movie in Christmas called Qué bello es vivir.
Oh yeah.
What's Qué bello es vivir in English?
It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah.
It's a Wonderful Life, where where this wonderful man has a bank and then explains, when you put money in the bank, this money goes and builds your neighbor's house and your children's schools and la-di-la.
Yeah.
And this is the idea that we get from what happens when you deposit your money in a bank. You say is more like a cloakroom, which is what you have in a club, where you deposit your...
Yeah, so unfortunately and this gets complicated, but in the public realm, people have a false idea that what banks do is to take money from you and lend it to other people. All right, and that's a very common way people imagine the banking sector. In reality, the banking sector doesn't do anything like that. The banking sector will build up reserves of state money, and then it will just issue out chips against that, right? And I don't know if you want to go into the depths of that, but this is the banking sector has the ability to create most of the money in the society that we use. And it's doing that every single time it's issuing loans to people. I'm kind of wary about going into that topic too much, because it very quickly gets complicated, but I can if you want. But the problem that we have in society, just to go back to the original point, is that many people imagine there's one type of money. All right, so they're imagining this is these monies going into the bank, and then the same money is leaving the bank and stuff, but it's nothing like this. What's happening is very much more like that casino situation. There's multiple different types of money issued by different players, right? And so the cash system is sort of your foundational form, but all those digital forms are secondary types of money being issued out, all right, in different situations. And many people haven't yet realized that when you become dependent upon those systems, you're basically becoming dependent on a kind of private enclosure controlled by the banking sector, essentially. So this term cashless society is really a kind of a euphemism to talk about a society where you're totally dependent upon a conglomeration of big finance and big tech.
Yeah, in a way, it's like the difference between the internet and, say, Facebook, no?
Yeah.
Well, the internet is a let's say it's a global network and it's privatized in a way, but not particularly centralized, while Facebook is a privatized, compact enclosure where all your data is captive.
I'll introduce one more core metaphor in the book, which is the bicycle metaphor.
Okay.
So this sometimes is quite a good way to help people to understand the implications of what's happening. So what's happened in the sort of, when people imagine that digital money is just some kind of upgrade to cash, it's a little bit like historically when people are thinking about horse carts versus cars, All right, so in the 1920s and 1910s, you'd have people who were using horse carts and stuff, and then the sort of automobile industry would come along and say, that's like some kind of old form of thing, and eventually you'll have to transition to cars, right? And so there's the idea that the horse cart becomes a car eventually, and then eventually everybody will do this, right? And they'll upgrade. Now, many people have internalized this idea that cash is like the horse cart of payments. So there's, some people still going to use cash, but eventually everyone will have to turn to the digital system, right? And the digital payments industry loves this metaphor because it makes out as if it's totally inevitable that everyone will eventually turn to this digital system. But to me, actually, the cash system is far more like the bicycle of payments, all right? So the best way to think about cash versus the digital money system is not to think of a horse carts versus cars, but it's to think about a public bicycle system versus Uber, all right? Now, imagine your entire transport system was run by Uber, the taxi app, right? You might superficially feel like, oh, maybe that's convenient, I don't know, maybe I like that, I don't know, but you can immediately see the political consequences if you've deferred control of your entire transport system to a private sector actor who can control access, who can watch everything you do, and who can exclude people, all right? Now, it's similar with the monetary system, right? You might actually like some of the digital apps and so on, and they might find them useful, but you don't want to defer your entire power of the monetary system to a single set of corporates, basically. So what I'm arguing for in Cloudmoney is to maintain a balance of power between the different parts of the monetary system. Much like if you're designing a transport system, you would create a balance of power between, say, the auto industry and the Ubers of the world and, say, the bicycle system. All right, and that's the sort of one of the core ways I tend to think about it.
Also, it's a good metaphor because while the digital system provides, let's say, more efficiency in speed, etc., when there is a natural disaster, it also provides a total lack of resilience.
It's very inefficient in the midst of a natural disaster.
Exactly.
Digital systems are actually highly as much as we live in a world which is full of digital hype, and we live under this kind of ideology that, advancement means becoming ever more fast, large-scale, complex, and automated. This is like a very dominant ideology in our society. It's actually a very, very flawed belief system. Actually, simpler systems are often better, all right? And most people know this in many ways, right? And in many situations, the cash system is literally superior to the digital systems.
For instance, when the power goes down.
Yeah, but it's much like, again, I use this metaphor of the bicycle. The bicycle is an older type of technology than the car and the Uber systems, and yet bicycles are more popular than they've ever been before, right? And people realize it's a simpler form of transport. Okay, I'm not going to cycle to the US with a bicycle. I'm not going to use it for certain types of things, but I like it being there. I want it to be there, and I think it's very similar with the cash system. Actually, often it works better. But we live under a dominant societal ideology that somehow there's something deviant and wrong about it. And the reason we live under that is that large-scale corporates basically cannot scale with the cash system, right? They are ideologically opposed to it because it slows down. Imagine Amazon trying to use the cash system. It can't. It's totally antithetical to the interests of super large-scale bureaucratic styles of corporations.
Yeah. Also, it stops supermarkets from getting rid of their humans.
Exactly. So while if you look at the sort of very banal way, or the sort of apolitical way the cash thing is spoken about, if you see the headlines, they'll talk about it as if it was this bottom-up process. They'll say, oh, people are just naturally moving away from the cash system because they just naturally see that it's better to become totally dependent upon the banking sector. All right? And that's simply not true. What's often been happening in our economies over time is that these large-scale institutions have been slowly eroding the alternative. to make it ever more likely, or to sort of nudge people ever closer towards being totally dependent upon their systems, right? And I'm not denying that people find some benefits and usefulness in the digital systems. What I'm countering is that the main source of power, or the main I'm countering this idea that the main reason for this change is just because ordinary people are just naturally deciding this, right?
Also, there's this false myth of convenience, no? When the real trade is based on friction. Like, if people choose to use digital money, it's probably because you have taken all the ATMs from the walls and they can't take actual cash from your offices anymore. Among a million different things. Also, during COVID, there was this myth that that cash was full of COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
And lots of the places that, in Spain at least, and in places like Berlin, that were very resistant to paying with plastic because they would be paying, a percentage of the money. Suddenly, they all embraced the only cards.
I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff from the COVID pandemic that came out. So, for example, in the US, the NFL, which is the big American football federation, entered into a deal with Visa, which Visa basically makes money from getting you to use the digital payment systems, right? Entered into a deal with Visa. This was in 2019, before the pandemic. Entered into a deal with them, a sponsorship deal, which said they would make their Super Bowls go cashless, all right? But this deal only started actually happening in 2020 when the pandemic hit. And when the first of these cashless Super Bowls happened, they very much used this idea that it was because of the pandemic. But this deal was signed way before the pandemic existed. They were always planning to do this, right? This was always in the agenda of these big institutions, all right? But the pandemic provided a very useful cover often, all right? So many of these players who actually subtly did want to sort of automate everything find it very, very convenient. And it's very, very telling when you go to places like London now, which have basically become almost entirely cashless, or entirely bank-dominated, should I say. A lot of the sort of chain retail stores and stuff in London used the pandemic. They said, oh, we're not going to take cash anymore because of the pandemic. Now in London, many of the restrictions from the pandemic have been pulled back. You can go to your stores, you don't have to wear masks and stuff. And yet all these retailers have kept this cashless policy because they were always planning to do it anyway, all right? And so they would just use this convenience. But of course, there's lots of disinformation was spread. Actually, during the pandemic, me and a group in London, we went to the Bank of England, which is the central bank in the UK, and said, why are you letting this disinformation be spread about the cash system, right? Because all these supermarkets and stuff were pushing out this idea that cash was spreading COVID. And actually, the Bank of England then commissioned a report into this, a scientific report, which they found that actually the touch screens, the people who are using these automated checkout systems, the PIN pads on the card terminals, trolley handles, things on shelves, all pose a far greater risk of transmitting COVID than cash did. And yet it was somehow cash was the thing being singled out, as if it was somehow the unique factor, right? And unfortunately that message has been spread, and it's been a very big win for the digital payments industry.
Yeah, now they're doing it for our own good. One of the other disinformation strategies would be that you would only use cash to go into a dark economy, into an informal economy. Otherwise, you would be using plastic, clean people. And
exactly.
Something that really hit me when I was some years ago, I was traveling to New Zealand, and my trip started in England, and I went from England to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong to Australia, and then from Australia to New Zealand. And one of the funny things, because I was stopping in every place for a couple of days, was that at the end I had in my hands cash from 4 different countries and 2 different continents, and yet all of them had Queen Elizabeth's face on it, which I thought it was a very interesting demonstration of power. But what you're describing in your book is that power going under, no? Like the power that you describe that comes with the digital age is a power that likes to be hidden.
Yeah, exactly. So if you reverse back 200 years or 100 years, there was a point in time when, for example, British pounds in cash form were at the forefront of the global economy. They were at the leading edge. All right. This is how you extended the power of the market system, right? But in the current context of our world right now, actually the cash system is viewed as something that's slowing down acceleration. It's slowing down the consolidation of power between, it stands in the way of all these big players who want to automate. So in the current moment, actually cash has become quite subversive. It's become quite, even though it has this sort of old school imagery, it's actually becoming quite a rebellious type of payment. All right, because essentially in using it, you're saying I'm not going along with that standard trajectory. All right, but what the digital payments industry and a lot of these players have been very, very effective at doing is associating the idea that if you want to be progressive, if you want to be modern looking, you have to be absorbed into their systems. And if you don't want to be absorbed into their systems, there's something wrong with you. You're a criminal. You're stuck in the past. You're whatever it is. You're dirty. You're low status. Right? So they basically associated the idea of their cultural domination with progress, which is a massive cultural victory, and this is what we have to push against, right? Because we can actually change that narrative to say actually progress does not mean being totally absorbed into Apple Pay. All right, and we can have different narratives.
Indeed. Apple Pay being yet another layer in your tier system that would be around the fifth.
Yeah, fifth
on the
Apple
scale.
Pay is a very good example of a pure fusion between big tech and big finance.
Indeed. But I really like this idea that a technology, let's say money is a technology that was developed as a source of power from the motherland, in this case, into the colonies, as for instance the telegraph was before it became the phone and then the internet network. That very technology has now become an obstacle to the same power. So I like it because we live in times where technologies have to be either good or evil, and yet this nuance that cash money offers, especially in a time where inevitably we're going to talk about crypto, where the idea of money itself is being challenged by infrastructures that project themselves into the future in ways that actually resemble cash, but it's not, but it's hyper-centralized. So let's talk about the centralization of power and control that comes with digital money as opposite to cash, because I think people have an idea that there is a surveillance layer to the digital payments. For instance, when you go to a restaurant and we do this thing that each one of us pays with a card, which is a total post-COVID thing for me. Like before COVID, I didn't see anyone doing it. That means that your payment method has a register of each one of the people sitting on that table, which I find very interesting. But there is a lot more trouble coming from that end.
So there's a series of probably 5 or so big categories of problems that emerge when you become totally dependent on large-scale digital infrastructures, which is what the digital, those cards and apps are, right? The first is actually just a sort of more political one. You're transferring too much power to a set of private sector actors. If you're interested in maintaining balances of power in society, it's always a bad idea to transfer too much power to one group. All right? This is just a more sort of, if you're interested in sort of like political capture, right? Making sure you got these balances of power in a society. So that's like one issue. But then more specifically, as you become totally dependent on these digital systems, surveillance is a very obvious one that comes out. There's a huge data trail attached to this, and payments data is particularly sensitive because it shows you how a person acts in society. In a market society, the only way you can survive is through exchange. None of us are growing our own food, or at least probably not, all right? The only way you survive in a market society is through exchange, and that type of data is incredibly sensitive because it shows you literally how you survive and what people are really doing. Okay, so many people are very interested in getting that data for a variety of reasons. Once you have that data, a huge new opportunity emerges for being able to control or block people's actions. All right, so right now people don't think about this very much because we still have the cash system. We still have an alternative, but in an actual situation where you didn't have an alternative, you would very quickly realize the political implications of being totally dependent upon institutions to intermediate between you when you're trying to interact in an economy. They could stop you doing all sorts of stuff, right? There's a lot of serious implications from that, okay? But then in a more sort of, one people don't think about, there's huge resilience problems. Your monetary system actually becomes weaker when you have everything sitting in these single systems. I'll give you a very simple example of this. In the US, the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank over there, they see a huge demand in the increase in the demand for cash when there's a hurricane approaching. This is very, very simple. People realize it's bad to be totally dependent on digital infrastructures when there's a hurricane. All right? This is a resilience problem. As soon as you lose that option, you've got very serious problems. If you're a national security official, or whether you're anybody who's interested in disasters and stuff, this is a very big problem. Another big issue is there's huge exclusion elements to digital systems. All right? If you can't get access to them, you're excluded. If you arrive in London right now without a card, you basically cannot interact with the economy. All right? There are many people who are like this. They're basically being pushed out of economies because they either don't want to get absorbed into the institutions or can't. All right? And then finally, there's a huge, this is a more sort of subtle point, is that actually decentralization in economies is often maintained by the cash system. If you think about how cash moves, it moves from person to person on the street. So cash might come from a central institution, but once it's out in the world, it sort of moves in a very localized, decentralized type of way. Whereas digital systems all route via these central structures. They basically have these huge central nodes, and that's how they operate. So if you're interested in maintaining a degree of decentralization in your economy, you want the cash system there, right? Because it helps to sort of counter that centralization tendency in the digital systems. And this is why, when I'm not advocating that everybody should constantly be using cash, but in terms of the overall design of a monetary system, you really have to protect that. Otherwise, the extremely negative sides of the digital systems come out.
Yeah, one of the things that I think about when I think about resilience and vulnerability in terms of digital money, I think about two things. One of them was how WikiLeaks was cut out of its own funding that had been given by its own followers, I guess, and supporters by not even a national bank, but by Visa and MasterCard, which gives you an idea of how many layers of control
and increasingly
you end up being under when you go digital, because digital also requires now applications in your phone that even constricts that privatization even more, but it also requires a plastic card that is run by Visa or MasterCard, which is not a bank. It's a different institution. And the other thing I think about on the other side is Russia after it invaded Ukraine. The thing is, if this ability to cut off a person
the
or
geopolitical elements of payment systems, and the geopolitics of digital payments is a topic that's been around for a long time. So one of the reasons, for example, that China designed the China Union Pay system, which is the card system in China, is precisely that the Chinese government doesn't want Visa and MasterCard intermediating between its citizens.
Obviously.
Imagine you're now dependent upon US-controlled corporations for interactions locally in your country. All right, that's a political situation that many states don't want to be in. So there's a huge hidden geopolitical element to payment systems, all right, which you don't necessarily notice if you're not on the receiving end of a geopolitical attack on your payment system. But even beyond the sort of like nation states, cyber attacks, all forms of new styles of attacks are happening on digital systems. So right now, if you're, for example, a national security professional, and you're looking at the situation, for example, let's look at London again, where they basically become almost totally digital as payment systems. This is a real serious risk if you're interested in maintaining the resilience of your economy against these types of attacks. So that is quite sort of, there's like a lot of different people who actually could probably agree that it's important to maintain this alternative.
Yes, so I think we're almost running out of time, so I would like to ask, ¿hay alguna pregunta del público?
Is there any question? Does the audience have any questions?
Because I'm that to come out of the crowd. No crypto questions here. ¿Alguien? ¿Nadie?
Nobody?
Crypto. I was hoping that yeah. Aquí hay una pregunta.
I see there's a question here. Sorry, how do you see the cash in the future? Do you think that it will disappear in the future, or will it resist?
I don't think cash will disappear, no. I think we live with a dominant story that says it will disappear. All right, so that's definitely true. We definitely live with a story that says it's going. But I think in reality, for a variety of reasons, actually it's going to be a lot more resilient. One of the reasons I'm out here sort of doing this stuff is to try and promote this idea of how to create these political movements. But even without me, there's many people who are fighting back on protecting the cash system. And it's not only activists, right, who are political activists, it's also quite sort of mainstream sort of like policy makers and stuff who realize the implications. So it's actually sort of quite a wide range of people. But I certainly think and actually one more thing I'll say is, so I think there's a variety of reasons why actually it will maintain, it could make a comeback, all right? So I don't want to be complacent. It certainly is very much under attack. But I also think even among younger generations, people who've been born into a situation of total domination by these big tech companies. If you're a teenager right now, you were basically born into a situation where everyone around you is using these systems and you can't really imagine something else, right? So and future generations, this is a very severe risk. But even people who are teenagers right now realize that there's a lot of problems emerging in digital systems. A lot of people realize they're basically addicted to their phones, for example, right? And that there's huge levels of mental health crises emerging, massive levels of sort of disorientation and disinformation that's emerging from these systems. So I think there's a lot of people in society who actually at some level realize that there's problems with becoming totally dependent on these systems, even if the dominant cultural story is that somehow they're naturally much better and they're inevitable. So I wouldn't bet against the cash system by any means. I think there's going to be a counter movement coming.
Aquí hay otra pregunta.
We have another question here. And to the second row.
I'd like to go back to the bicycle metaphor. Bicycles are still popular, but there's a whole industry behind them. There's people making money out of it, not as much as with cars, but they're still tapping into that market. But you make it sound like no one in power is interested in keeping the cash model alive. So why would they?
So the cash system has no private sector actors behind it other than the industry that makes the cash. All right? And that's a small industry. So the central banks who issue cash, they hire companies to actually make it. All right? So there's a small industry who does the actual making of the cash. That's not they're tiny compared to the digital payments industry, right? But the actual issuer of cash is these state players, and because they're public institutions, they don't do private sector style marketing. If you go to a central bank and you say, will you let the public know about the cash system? They say, that's not our job. That would be too partial. We'd appear to be biased. All right? But of course, on the other side, the digital payments companies are constantly telling you that their systems are better. So it's a highly unequal situation. You have a very, very loud private sector industry constantly telling you that cash is terrible and that you're somehow stuck in the past. And then no promoter here. This is why it's almost like a public utility. It's a public infrastructure. This is part of the problem. So a lot of what I've been doing and others have been trying to go to central banks and say, hey, if you're interested in the politics of this and actually interested in keeping a level playing field, you're going to have to start to actually come out and tell people about the situation. But yeah, there's really not an industry that's benefiting from the cash system.
Hola, mira, quería...
I would like to remind, I would like you to dig a little bit deeper into the geopolitical aspect. We are seeing that in Spain we are getting used to making payments with our mobiles, but I understand that this has been going on for quite a while in China. They are actually threatening the international financial system because it's dominated by the United States and the Western countries, as we have seen with international payments, with what is going on with Russia. And China, as other countries, is trying to catch up to establish a different international payment system. I would like you to go deeper into this, because to a certain extent their economy is quite digitalized as well.
All right, I'll try my best because there's a lot of... Yeah, so as mentioned, there's a huge geopolitical element to payments, all right? And China definitely is making a play to try and get more global dominance in the payment system. In China right now, it's incredibly digital. People are all operating often through these digital payments, these mobile payment systems run by Alibaba or Alipay and Tencent, which are these companies that control these mobile payment systems. And the Chinese government's been very much pushing this idea that this is a path forward, right? And there's a bunch of dynamics internal to China about why we can discuss about why. But what's now happening is that actually, one of the things about, I'm trying to think how to sequence this answer, because it's quite complicated. Historically, the US dollar has been something. So let's talk about my family in Zimbabwe. My family's from Zimbabwe, all right? And Zimbabwe is a country which its own currency evaporated under bad political management, right? And what happened is that Zimbabwe dollarized. Basically, they started using the US dollar. They started using the currency of a different country, all right? So in Zimbabwe right now, people would use US dollars in cash for transactions. And this is what my family in Zimbabwe will often do, all right? Now, the situation that we will start to have is, for example, if China, what they've been discussing is issuing their own form of state-issued digital money, which is a whole other topic in itself, which I haven't really started, took my chair. Hypothetically, my family in Zimbabwe could start to say, well, you know what, we maybe can just download a type of digital yuan app and start using some China-based system for our interactions between us. All right, now you'll start to have relative shifts in global power between these big, like, US versus China. So there's a whole kind of almost like Cold War style politics to the payments question. And it's quite a difficult question to answer because there's so many players jostling right now for position. All right, so you'll find there's all the existing banking sectors who are running all the kind of like digital payment systems, but then there's all this new discussion about central bank digital currencies, which is nation states who are considering issuing a digital form of state money, all right? And I don't know how far I should go into that, because it's, I don't want to confuse everybody with a long alienating answer. But basically, nation states, the sort of balance of power in the monetary system has been disrupted, right? Because historically, in a normal country, there was often a balance of power between the state, who issues the cash, and then the digital system, which is controlled by the banking sector. But because the cash system is being undermined, the nation states are starting to feel like they maybe need to issue this digital form of money. But if they do that, they destabilize their own banking sectors, right? And if you're a capitalist state, you don't want to do that because you want your banking sector to succeed. But they feel pressure to do this because China is now considering doing it. And if China does it, they could geopolitically be undermined. So there's a whole sort of web of politics going on in the system. And then to add to that, there's a whole new realm of things called stable coins, which are these sort of a new type of money that people are using, which could also disrupt some of the incumbent players. Sorry, it's a very long and complicated answer, but the basic point is that there's a whole bunch of instability in the global monetary system right now, and there's a huge geopolitical element to it.
Well, one of the things that is useful to say regarding the China, I think, almost complete digitization of money is that it is one of the foundational steps of its control over citizens.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, and their score system for citizenry.
Yeah, the social credit system.
Exactly. And the social credit system allows for you to buy things or to buy into things or not. Meaning that if your score is low, it manifests as in you cannot buy a train ticket or you cannot buy a plane ticket.
And it's very interesting, during the Hong Kong protests, there are these scenes of protesters who otherwise would have been using digital apps because they were young people, and they were often queuing up in the train stations to buy tickets with cash. And the reason is that they know very, very well, if you use digital payments to buy your tickets and somebody's watching that, they can see person buys ticket here, person exits here. What does that mean? Person's getting off at this station, right? High correlation, this person could be a protester of some sort, and they understood this, right? So then you use cash to get your ticket, right, as a way to shield yourself from that. Now imagine that cash doesn't exist. In this situation, you're going to be, not only can you be watched, but hypothetically you can be stopped. Hypothetically, somebody can say, reject person's attempt to buy a ticket. These are hypothetical examples. We haven't actually seen them. Well, actually, there are situations where they have been used, but this is the real implications of when you become too dependent on those systems.
Well, in Madrid, you can't buy a ticket with cash anymore. You need to have a card that has your name and your address on it.
Yeah, and this is partially when institutions do this. This is partly how you push the culture in that direction. For example, I live in Germany right now in Berlin, which is, many people in Germany use cash a lot. There's a very privacy-aware culture. But Lufthansa, which is the national flag carrier of Germany, made a corporate decision to refuse to allow them to use cash on board. That's got nothing to do with what Germans want. If you ask Germans, they would say, we would prefer to have this ability to use cash. We're actually a society that likes using cash. Lufthansa decided. The Lufthansa executives decided that, right? And when they did that, they sent a cultural message into the society that we don't accept this anymore. There's something wrong if you think it's normal. This is how you slowly shame people and shift a culture.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta?
Is there any other question in the audience?
Hello. What measures do you consider to prevent a cashless society right now? To governments, what could they do? To prevent that in the future?
Sure. Yeah. There's multiple aspects to this. So I think there's a series of different styles of legislation. So, for example, in the US, at a local government level in the US, a lot of cities like Philadelphia have put out laws saying you can't refuse cash. So bear in mind how the implosion in cash usage happens is through the intersection of three things. It's access to cash, acceptance of cash, and then the ability for businesses to deposit cash. So for example, if banks are shutting down ATMs, access to cash goes down. It becomes harder to find it. So you find yourself more likely to use the alternative. That's the access part. The acceptance part is, okay, fine, I get the cash, but can I actually use it? All right. So you can target the access element to say we need to maintain the infrastructure, and then the acceptance thing is around saying we need to preserve the ability to actually use it. So you should have like laws saying it's exclusionary to stop the person using cash. But then there's a third part, which is if you're a business and the banks are shutting down all their branches and shutting down your ability to deposit cash, then of course it makes it more likely as a business that you don't want to accept cash anymore, because now, for example, I'm not sure how big this issue is in Spain right now, but in places like the UK and Sweden and stuff, this is a very, very big problem. The banks basically refuse to take cash now. So you have to drive miles and miles and miles to deposit cash, which means, of course, as a business, you're going to say, I'm no longer going to accept it, which of course reduces the access. And then the banks say, oh, well, people are not using it as much anymore, so we'll shut down the ATMs. All right, so it creates these feedback loops, which then they can sort of create these self-fulfilling prophecies. So if you want to stop that, you got to stop the shutdown of the infrastructure, and you've got to have the laws about the acceptance, and you've got to make sure that the banks themselves, which control access to the cash system, have to play their role, right? But bear in mind, the banks are competing against cash because they run the alternative infrastructure. So the perverse thing, the situation that we have, is that the banking sector controls access to its competitor, all right, which is a bad situation to be in, right? So you need to basically stop them. And if you speak to any central bank, they all know this. They will all tacitly agree with this argument. They say, yes, the banks are slowly shutting down the cash infrastructure. And they just do it bit by bit. All right, so you need to stop the process. But then more generally, we need a cultural movement to actually create a counter-narrative to say it's totally fine to to say that we don't want to be dependent upon those corporate systems. All right, so you need to create this cultural movement that says it's totally acceptable to use analog systems.
And instead of that, we have crypto.
Yeah, the crypto world is an interesting issue right now.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Is there any other question?
Hola, primero gracias por...
First of all, thank you for this inspiring conversation. And since you're talking about crypto, I would like to ask you if this decentralization that we see with the crypto and with the technology of blockchain will end up being controlled by this centralized power in the end, breaking this sort of struggle between the cash and the traditional digital money. How do you see this looking forward?
Okay. So one quick anecdote to start with is actually before coming to Madrid, I was in Lisbon and I was at a crypto conference. All right. And a guy from Google stepped onto the stage there and he started talking about something called Web 2.5. All right. Now, if you're involved in the sort of crypto world, you'll know that they use a term called Web 3 to talk about their systems in the crypto world. All right. And they'll say Web 2 is big tech companies. Right? Web 3 is the world of decentralized digital crypto, right? But this guy from Google turns up and he says, Web 2.5, this is what we work on, which is basically when Google fuses into these crypto architectures and starts to use them for its own purposes. Okay, now this is in 2022, right? This is what's happening right now, is that a lot of these big tech companies are starting to creep a lot into the crypto world. But if you go back to the origins of, when you go back to, I was involved in the early Bitcoin community, for example, which is the first crypto platform to emerge. There was a lot of this rhetoric that crypto was all about creating this alternative to the big tech, big finance vortex, okay? Or big tech, big finance, big state vortex. And actually, if you look at the origins of the crypto movements back into the 1990s, there were these groups called like the cypherpunks and others who were saying, if we end up in a cashless society, we're going to have huge problems of centralization of power and all those things, those negative aspects we've been discussing. So there is actually within the crypto movements a lot of intuition that it's a problem to be totally dependent upon those centralized infrastructures. The main problem, though, is that actually the crypto systems have largely failed to actually create a viable alternative. So I was involved in the early Bitcoin community, and a lot of the excitement around Bitcoin was to do with the fact that the underlying technology essentially enables very large groups of people, huge networks of people, to coordinate action between themselves without there being a central party there, right? Historically, if you have a small group like here, we could probably coordinate action between ourselves without asking an authority to do it. But if you're dealing with a network of 10,000 people or 1 million people, what we normally do is we use these institutions to intermediate at that large scale. So what people in the crypto world were so excited about was this idea that you could do large scale coordination without central parties. All right, and this was always this idea. But unfortunately, in the case of Bitcoin, this ingenious technological architecture, which also has a lot of destructive elements to it as well, was used to implement a very, very crude type of token system. And in reality, those tokens became just things to be traded in the normal monetary system. All right, much like anything else that we use the normal monetary system for. So in reality, most crypto tokens have just become objects to be bought and sold with money. They haven't become the actual monetary system themselves, right? Which is why they're so massively volatile, because also they are very seldom connected back into any kind of real world thing, which is why you have these massive crashes and spikes in prices all the time, all right? So it's true that, and I'll end this question now because I'm kind of just waffling on, but there are some new strategies that crypto has introduced into society. It's true, for example, if I am a political refugee and I can sort of briefly use Bitcoin maybe to engage in some form of exchange. But I also, if you're a kind of a person who's on the edges of society, you don't want to be holding something that's massively spiking and crashing in price all the time, all right? You're already in an insecure situation. You're already in an unstable situation, and now you don't want your whole world to be dependent upon these assets that are subject to crazy levels of speculation. All right. So the crypto world, and I could spend hours talking about the dynamics of Bitcoin because I have a lot of experience with it, but it's operating in a very a state of cognitive dissonance, basically. This idea that how would I phrase this? Okay, can I say one last thing about this? And I'll end with this element. The best way to understand the crypto world right now, these things like Bitcoin, is to see them as being a bit like a monetary parasite. Okay, so if I was an ecologist looking at an ecosystem with different creatures, and I saw a parasite, that's not necessarily a critique. I could say, actually, being a parasite is quite a successful strategy. There are many very successful parasites in the world. All right, the parasites rely upon a host. And actually, the only reason why things like Bitcoin actually work is that they are hosted by the US dollar system. All right. There's a speculative market for these tokens in US dollars, which gives these things a price, which in turn enables them to be swapped for other things. So in many ways, the Bitcoin system is kind of an ingenious monetary parasite. So it's been a kind of a success in a way, but But this is very, very different to the self-image of the Bitcoin community, which wants to imagine that it's like a predator, like a lion, that's going to destroy the US dollar. But in reality, it rides on top of the existing monetary system, right? And that's, whether you think that's a critique or not, really depends on your situation, right? I think that's interesting, right? But I don't feel like it's a useful, the problem I have now is that when I'm working, trying to convince people about the cash system and the importance of maintaining the cash system, I often get these crypto people coming to me saying, oh, don't worry, the problem's been solved by Bitcoin. And I say, the problem hasn't been solved by Bitcoin, and also you're distracting attention from a very real problem. You know, you're placing your hopes in this sort of like incredibly, actually quite crudely designed system, when in reality the vast majority of the world's population still relies on this other system, and it's much more important to be building a movement to protect this existing thing than to talk about this other thing. And so in a weird way, the crypto world is actually joined in creating more and more digital hype, which actually is in the interests of big tech, right? Which leads me back to my final point, which was that I'm in Lisbon last week, and a guy from Google's on the stage talking about how great it is to do Web 2.5, which is basically big tech fusing with crypto. Sorry, that's a super long answer, but hopefully it made sense.
Yeah, it is kind of weird that a system that praises itself of being self-sufficient actually so dependent on the system that is trying to replace.
Yeah, and again, politically, you can argue that that's important. You know, you can still say, look, there's things happening here that could be useful to people, right? But that's very different to the core claim that's often made by the crypto communities, which is like, we're totally revolutionizing everything. It's like, yeah, I mean, no.
No. So we're definitely running out of time, but I would like to ask you a last question, just for closure. You've been studying alternative modes of currency, of money, of trading. So apart from cash, what keeps you excited? What excites your interest these days?
Yeah. I could also talk for hours about this question. So my current agenda with this book here is about protecting that balance of power in the existing monetary system and looking at that, right? But I also have a sort of more, maybe a more kind of idealistic side of me, which is about interesting new types of alternative money, right? And I've historically worked on those types of money, the sort of local currencies and mutual credit systems. I don't know how many of you have had experience with these types of alternatives, so which existed for a very long time. So I think if I was to put my efforts into some sort of new, interesting type of system, I would be looking right now at rippling credit systems, which I briefly mentioned at the very end of this book. But rippling credit systems are quite interesting. If you come from a monetary anthropology background like me, you will often realize that monetary systems are very often created through the issuance of promises, right? So, you know, if you have something, I can actually issue a promise to get that thing from you. And now you hold the promise and I hold the thing, all right? And this is paying by promise, all right? And actually many of our existing monetary systems are highly institutionalized versions of a similar principle. You have these massive institutions that will issue out these liabilities or these IOUs, which you then use as money. But you can actually create more peer-to-peer sort of horizontal versions of those systems now. And so if you think about the concept of 6 degrees of separation, if I know you and you know somebody there and then there's somebody else in there, I can go through you to get to somebody else, right? And actually, so if you think about this process of issuing promises to get things, there are these new systems called rippling credit systems, which are about, can you create these rippling dominoes of promises between people in a society to create a kind of horizontal, dynamic kind of exchange system. I'm not giving the best description, but this is something I find very, very fascinating, right? I would actually be interested in working on something like that. And if anybody wants to look at those types of things, I also write a newsletter which is called Altered States of Monetary Consciousness, where I explore some of these sort of more these alternative types of money systems.
All right.
Yeah.
So that is that. Altered states of money. Gracias a todos por venir. Thank you book and for being here in Madrid for a few hours with us. Ya no nos queda tiempo.
I'm afraid we don't have more time, I'm sorry. Or maybe we do? No, I'm sorry, we don't have more time for questions. Hey, it looks like we do have time for another question. The lady on the fourth row. Good afternoon and congratulations on this event. Are you going to ask a question? What's happening with the metaverse? Because with the blockchain technology, it's already unstoppable. The whole crypto world is there, and the metaverse is already on. So what's going on with that?
What's going on with the metaverse? I don't know. Is there anything going on with the metaverse? I have a very interesting. I remember this. I went to a virtual reality festival in New York once, right? And it was all these very high-end virtual reality companies were showcasing all their like VR systems, right? And they had all these kind of tents where people would line up and they'd sit and they'd do this stuff and they're looking around their VR headsets, right? But in the middle of the festival grounds, there was a very, very simple, I don't know how you would call it in Spanish, but I would call it these like bouncy castles, which are these sort of, these inflatable things that kids bounce on, right? So,
Un castillo inflable. Todos saben lo que es eso, ¿no?
So somebody had made one, which is a big white square, right? And it didn't have any doors, but you could push your way through the wall into this thing. And kids were going crazy, but not only kids, adults were going crazy for this very, very simple thing, which was a blow-up house that you can push through the wall and go out again. And it was by far the most popular thing at this festival. And it didn't require any advanced technology. It didn't require anything. Human beings don't actually need that much to feel engaged and excited with the environment, right? We're constantly told that like what you want is like insanely advanced graphics and so on. But I'll tell you what makes people happy often, looking at the stars, watching a fire. We don't really need this stuff. So if I was an investor looking at the metaverse right now, I'd be like, okay, we're living under a sort of ideology that says, yes, it's going to be like this massive thing. Maybe with a younger generation that's really into gaming, I could sort of imagine you have an advantage in terms of like maybe convincing them that this is going to be the future. But in reality, I think human beings get sick of digital systems. You get bored of them, right? And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a massive flop, right? But of course, these companies are all going to go ahead with it because they don't know anything else. This is the only thing you can do as a big corporation is just constantly try to push more stuff, right? So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Una última pregunta.
One last question, and this is the really last question. Nobody raises their hands now. Hi. With all these initiatives that we see now, Euro token or centralized currencies in centralized blockchain systems, do you think that it is an additional effort from the governments in order to have a greater traceability and further control? Do you think that this is a sort of evolution from the cash that we know, this type of centralized tokens and under the control of governments, or do you see any new opportunities in this field?
So I presume you're talking about the sort of central bank digital currency concept. So and I was sort of touching briefly on some of this, the politics of this with an earlier question. So if you're a capitalist state, which most European countries are, you have states that will support industry, right? Or the US. You don't necessarily want to compete with your industry, all right? So again, central banks don't necessarily, right now, the banking sector, you know, Santander, BBVA, all these kind of, run the digital infrastructure. That's their domain. Now, if you're a central bank and you say, okay, I'm going to bring out a digital wallet where you can use essentially a kind of first level sort of cash equivalent, albeit one that we can watch on an app, you're directly going to be competing now with Santander. All right. And politically, that's difficult because Santander's executives are going to come to you and they say, what are you doing? You're going to have lobbying from the banking sector saying, what are you doing? You're edging in on our business. And so what they'll then do is they'll force the central banks and stuff to water that stuff down. They'll say, okay, well, maybe we issue some kind of digital thing, but you can only use a very small amount of it or whatever. There'll be some kind of political compromise if it happens to say, you're not going to undermine our business, right? And so this is what's there's a lot of debate in these sort of circles about these and a lot of libertarians are often very concerned because they're saying, what's going to happen is there's going to be these nation states spying on us and so on. But bear in mind, the power of capitalist states comes from the corporate sector, right? If you undermine your corporate sector, you lose geopolitical power. If the US Federal Reserve undermines Visa or undermines its banking sector, it loses geopolitical power, right? So actually it's not obvious that nation states want to do that, right? But many of them are sort of saying right now, they're like, well, maybe we could think about this. And again, there's these geopolitical elements if China starts to do it and so on. But of course, yeah, if you did end up with a situation where suddenly the ECB and stuff were like issuing this thing that's competing, well, we could see. And actually there's different ways you could design that. There's more or less privacy preserving ways of designing those systems. And that would be a debate that has to happen. But right now, I'd be you got to be skeptical about whether it actually happens or not. Did that answer? Yeah.
All right. Bueno. Y muchas gracias por haber venido.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, Brad.
Gracias. Y avisaros.
Thank you. I would like to tell you that Brett is going to be signing books at the entrance to this hall. So if you have a book or if you want to buy your book, which you can buy here, you can have Brett signing them for you. These books are being sold at the entrance of this hall. So thank you very much. Thank you.